The very instant Caleb Warren laid eyes on the woman stepping off the train in Cedar Falls, Montana territory, he made a silent, ironclad vow. She would be back on those rails by sundown. To Caleb, his sister Margaret's latest attempt at meddling wasn't a gesture of love. It was an insult to the memory of the woman he'd already buried. He had spent 3 years building a fortress of solitude out of Montana timber and cold grief, and he wasn't about to let a mail-order replacement breach the walls. But as Lydia Hail turned her gaze toward him, eyes the color of a winter sky, weary but unmistakably dignified, the rejection he had spent 3 days rehearsing died in his throat like a bitter pill. If you are watching this from somewhere across this vast world, drop a comment with your city below. I truly love seeing how far these stories of the old frontier travel. Now, settle in, hit that like button, and let me tell you about the 3 days that changed everything on the Warren Ranch. The November wind howling across the Bitterroot Valley carried the sharp, metallic scent of impending snow and the mournful whistle of the 247 from Missoula. Caleb Warren stood on the wooden platform, his hat pulled low against the gale and his jaw set with the hardness of the granite peaks lining the horizon. In his coat pocket, his fingers traced the frayed edge of a letter that had arrived 3 weeks prior, written in his sister's precise schoolteacher's hand. She is respectable, educated, and entirely alone in the world, Margaret had urged. The ranch needs a woman's touch, Caleb. Emma would have wanted... He had stopped reading at the mention of his late wife's name. Margaret hadn't been there to see the color drain from Emma's face as the fever took hold. She hadn't spent those agonizing weeks praying to a god who seemed to have turned his back, only to bury her in ground so frozen they'd had to wait for the spring thaw to dig deep enough. To Caleb, loving someone was simply providing the heavens with a target for more sorrow. The train's brakes shrieked against the iron rails, and Caleb's stomach tightened into a knot. He had his speech ready, polite, firm, and final. He would offer this Lydia Hail a ticket back east, a few extra dollars for her trouble, and an apology for his sister's overreach. He would explain that his life was built on routine and memory, and there was no room in it for a stranger. The passenger doors groaned open, and a handful of travelers descended, a traveling salesman clutching his sample cases, an elderly couple leaning on one another, and a few rugged cowboys looking for work in the nearby logging camps. Caleb scanned the platform, bracing for the sight of a woman who would surely be either desperate or delusional to accept an arrangement like this. Then she appeared. Lydia Hail stepped onto the platform, not with the hesitation of a victim, but with the posture of someone accustomed to carrying the world on her shoulders. She stood with her back straight, gripping a heavy carpet bag in one hand, while a porter wrestled a battered trunk down behind her. Her traveling dress had once been of fine, dark blue wool, but the fabric was now thinned at the elbows and stained with the dust of 1,000 miles. Her auburn hair was pinned in a severe, simple knot beneath a modest hat, and her face, Caleb felt a sudden, sharp catch in his chest. She wasn't beautiful in the soft, effortless way Emma had been. Lydia's features were carved from stronger lines, with high, prominent cheekbones and a mouth that looked as though it had long ago forgotten the shape of a smile. Her grey eyes were wide and clear, holding the gaze of someone who had seen too much and expected very little in return. She scanned the platform with a quiet, careful assessment, her dignity intact despite the threadbare state of her clothes. Their eyes met across 30 feet of weathered planking. There was no flicker of surprise in her expression, only a weary kind of confirmation, as if she'd been mentally preparing herself for disappointment and was relieved to find it arriving right on schedule. She walked toward him with measured, steady steps. "Mr. Warren," she said, her voice lower than he had anticipated, roughened slightly by the grit of the journey. "Miss Hail," he replied, touching the brim of his hat out of habit rather than hospitality. "I'm afraid there has been a significant misunderstanding. My sister Margaret arranged this without my knowledge or consent. I am truly sorry you traveled all this way for nothing, but I intend to pay for your return ticket immediately, along with a stipend for the inconvenience." He watched her closely, expecting tears or perhaps an indignant outburst, but her face remained a mask of neutral composure. Lydia was silent for a long moment, her grey eyes studying him with an intensity that made him want to look away. She turned her head slightly to watch the conductor calling the final boarding for westbound passengers. That train is heading for Seattle, she noted quietly. The eastbound return doesn't come through Cedar Falls until Thursday. That's 3 days from now. The realization hit Caleb like a physical blow. In his haste to settle the matter, he hadn't checked the schedules. He had assumed he could simply put her back on a train and be done with the situation within the hour. I see, he stammered, his mind racing. The hotel in town is— I have 47 cents to my name, Mr. Warren, she interrupted, her voice factual and devoid of any plea for pity. I spent the last of my savings on the ticket to get here. The wind gusted between them, biting and cold, carrying the first crystalline flakes of the season's first real blizzard. Lydia didn't flinch, but Caleb noticed the slight, uncontrollable tremble in her shoulders, an exhaustion that went deeper than just a long train ride. He thought of his vows to be a good man, of the person Emma had loved, and he realized with a bitter clarity that he couldn't leave a woman standing on a frozen platform with less than 50 cents and nowhere to go. He couldn't be that man and still look at himself in the mirror tomorrow morning. The ranch is 6 miles out, he said gruffly, reaching for her trunk. You can stay there until Thursday. There is a separate room, and I expect nothing from you. On Thursday, you take the eastbound train to wherever it is you choose to go. Lydia gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture of gratitude that carried absolutely no hope. The journey back to the Warren Ranch was draped in a heavy, uncomfortable silence, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the occasional cry of a hawk circling above. Lydia sat beside him, her hands folded neatly over her carpet bag, making herself as small as possible, as if she had learned long ago not to take up more space than was strictly necessary. When they finally crested the last rise, the ranch came into view. It had once been a jewel of the valley, but now it looked like the home of a man who only cared about survival. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged under the weight of neglect, and the windows looked as dark and empty as blind eyes. Caleb felt a sudden, unexpected flash of shame seeing his home through her eyes. But Lydia said nothing. She simply waited for him to set the brake, then climbed down without assistance, staring at the house with that same careful, silent assessment. Inside the house, the air was stagnant, smelling of cold ash and long-buried memories that had been trapped behind closed doors for far too long. Caleb lit the lamps, the flickering orange glow revealing thick layers of dust that had claimed the furniture like a slow-moving tide. He gestured toward the steep staircase with a stiff hand. Guest room is at the top, second door on the right. There's bedding in the cedar chest. I'll bring your trunk up once I've tended the stock. Lydia moved toward the stairs with that same measured, ghost-like pace, pausing only at the threshold of the kitchen to ask if she might use the pantry to prepare her own meals. Caleb told her to help herself, his voice echoing with an unnatural, hollow ring in the vast, silent room. He stood in the entryway for a long time after she retreated, listening to the soft, rhythmic creak of floorboards overhead as she moved about. He had braced himself for the sound of sobbing or the frantic rustle of someone desperately unpacking, but the silence that followed was thick and absolute. It was the heavy silence of two people who had both forgotten how to truly live in a house, existing instead in a space that felt less like a home and more like a tomb for things that had passed. The walls seemed to watch them both, waiting for a heartbeat that hadn't been felt here in years. Caleb realized with a start that he was holding his breath, as if the mere presence of another soul had disrupted the carefully curated vacuum of his grief. The second morning arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum, the heavy frost on the windows creating intricate icy patterns that obscured the world outside. Caleb woke in the dark, as was his long-standing habit, and moved quietly down the stairs, careful to avoid the specific floorboards he knew would groan under his weight. But to his profound surprise, the house was already awake and breathing. The sharp, invigorating scent of fresh coffee and the warm, buttery aroma of rising bread hit him before he even reached the bottom step. He found Lydia in the kitchen, a dark silhouette against the glowing wood stove, her auburn hair already pinned up in a severe knot and her apron tied tight. On the table sat a plate of golden brown biscuits, still steaming and fragrant. Caleb sat down slowly, the simple, unexpected kindness of a prepared meal feeling like a physical weight in his chest. The first bite brought a rush of sensory memory so sharp it almost brought him to his knees. It wasn't that they tasted exactly like Emma's, but rather that they tasted of intentional care, a sensation he had strictly forbidden himself from experiencing in 3 long years. "You didn't have to do this," he managed to say, his voice sounding foreign even to his own ears. He looked at the steam rising from his mug, feeling as though the warmth was reaching a part of him that had been frozen since the last winter Emma was alive, a part he had thought was dead and buried. "I know I didn't," Lydia replied softly, pouring him a fresh cup of coffee without being asked, her movements fluid and sure. "But I cannot sit idle for 3 days, Mr. Warren. It is simply not in my nature to be a passenger in my own life. If I am to stay under your roof, even for a short time, I would much prefer to be useful." Caleb studied her over the rim of his cup, noticing the way she moved with a quiet, practiced economy, as if every gesture was calculated to minimize her impact on his personal space. He told her the house could use some straightening, a gross understatement given the years of neglect, and then quickly retreated to the barn to escape the unsettling feeling of another presence in his kitchen. When he returned at noon for a quick meal, the transformation was nothing short of staggering. The kitchen was no longer a dusty tomb. The iron counters were scrubbed, the floor swept clean of grit, and the mismatched dishes organized with meticulous, thoughtful precision. In the parlor, the heavy velvet curtains that had been drawn shut since Emma's funeral were finally open, allowing the thin, pale winter sunlight to illuminate surfaces that had been polished with lemon oil until they gleamed. The air no longer smelled of stagnant grief and wood smoke, but of lye soap and the strange, terrifying possibility of a clean slate. It was as if she had reached into the past and dragged the house, kicking and screaming, back into the light of the present day. As the second day bled into the third, Caleb found himself increasingly off balance, caught between the comfort of his routine and the disruption of her efficiency. He found Lydia in the pantry, holding one of Emma's last jars of preserved tomatoes, her fingers tracing the faded, elegant handwriting on the label with a kind of reverence. "I found these," she said softly, her voice devoid of judgment or prying curiosity. "They are still good. Would you mind if I opened a jar for our supper tonight?" The question landed like a physical punch to his gut. Those preserves were the last tangible pieces of Emma's labor, a summer's worth of Montana sunshine captured in glass by a woman who was no longer there to see them eaten. His first instinct was to snap at her, to protect that last vestige of his old life with a roar of anger, but he saw the look in Lydia's eyes, a recognition of his pain that wasn't pity, but a shared understanding of what it meant to hold on to ghosts. "No," he said, his voice sounding rough and cracked like dry earth. "I don't mind." That night, they ate a stew made with those very tomatoes, and for the first time in years, Caleb felt a flicker of something other than cold rage. He was angry that a stranger could make his house feel like a home again, but underneath that anger, a hairline crack was forming in the fortress he had built around his heart, letting in a sliver of light he wasn't sure he was ready to see. The work on the ranch didn't stop for emotional upheaval, and on the final afternoon before the eastbound train was due, a heavy beam in the barn finally gave way under the weight of the coming snow. It was a 2-person job, one that Caleb had intended to struggle through alone with a combination of pulleys and sheer stubborn will. But Lydia appeared in the barn doorway, wrapped in a heavy shawl he recognized as one of Emma's favorites. She didn't ask if he needed help. She simply walked to the support post and asked where he needed her to set her weight. Together they worked in a surprising, wordless harmony, her physical strength belying her slender frame as she braced the timber while he secured the bolts. As he worked, he realized he hadn't spoken this much, or worked this closely with another human being in years. "My brother taught me how to fix things," she said, her breath misting in the freezing air as the wind whistled through the slats. "He said a woman should never wait for a man to do what she can do herself, for waiting is just another form of being trapped." Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw not a mail-order bride or a social burden, but a woman of immense quiet courage who was carving her own space out of the wilderness. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was beginning to fill with the weight of things left unsaid, and the prospect of the Thursday train was beginning to feel less like a release and more like a closing door. That evening, the reality of the Thursday deadline loomed over them like the long, cold shadow of the mountains. Lydia sat by the fire, mending a pile of Caleb's wool shirts that had been neglected for months, her needle flashing rhythmically in the lamplight. Caleb watched her from across the room, the sound of the needle against the fabric the only noise in the sudden stillness. He found himself asking about her life in Philadelphia, and the story that emerged was one of profound betrayal and quiet resilience. She had been a respected schoolteacher, engaged to a man who saw her as a convenience rather than a partner. When she discovered his infidelity and broke the engagement, his wealthy family had used their influence to ensure she was blacklisted from every school in the city. "I had a choice between total destitution and a one-way train ticket to Montana," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the pain behind the words. "I chose the ticket because I would rather be a stranger in a new land than a ghost in my own city." Caleb realized then that they were both survivors of different kinds of storms. He was hiding from the world because he was terrified of more loss, while she was facing the world because she had nothing left to lose. As the clock on the mantel ticked toward midnight, the thought of her boarding that train tomorrow morning began to feel less like a return to order and more like a profound, irreversible mistake. Thursday morning arrived with a silence so heavy it felt as though the very air had turned to lead. The distant, mournful wail of the eastbound train echoed through the valley, a cold reminder that the 3-day grace period had reached its end. Lydia stood by the front door, her battered trunk already waiting on the porch and her threadbare carpet bag gripped tightly in her hand. She looked around the kitchen one last time, her gaze lingering on the gleaming surfaces and the organized pantry she had so carefully restored to life. Caleb watched her from the shadows of the hallway, a storm of conflicting emotions warring in his chest. For 3 years he had convinced himself that silence was his only sanctuary, but now that the silence was about to return, it felt like a death sentence. He realized with a jolt of terrifying clarity that if she walked out that door, the light she had brought into the house would vanish with her, leaving him alone in a tomb of his own making. As the train whistle sounded again, closer this time, the words he had spent years suppressing finally fought their way to the surface. "Don't go," he said, the sound of his own voice startling him with its raw honesty. Lydia froze, her back to him, her shoulders tensed against the cold. "The train is coming, Mr. Warren," she whispered, not turning around. "And we both know there is nothing for me here but a ghost and a man who is afraid to remember her." "I am afraid," Caleb admitted, stepping into the light of the kitchen, "but I am more afraid of what this house becomes when you aren't in it." He walked toward her, his boots heavy on the floorboards she had scrubbed until they shone. "Stay for a week, not as a wife, not as a burden, but as a partner. Let us see if we can find a way to live in the present instead of the past. If after 7 days you still wish to leave, I will drive you to the station myself, and I will ensure you have enough to start a new life wherever you choose." Lydia turned then, and for the first time Caleb saw a flicker of something other than weary resignation in her grey eyes. It was a spark of hope so fragile it looked as though a breath might extinguish it. She studied him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation or deceit, but found only the desperate sincerity of a man finally reaching for a lifeline. She slowly set her carpetbag down on the floor, the sound a quiet declaration of war against the solitude they had both endured. "1 week," she agreed, her voice steady. "But I will not live in the shadows of a woman I never knew. If I stay, you must tell me about her. You must let her be a part of this house again, or I will never truly be here at all." The days that followed were a delicate dance between the living and the dead. Caleb kept his promise, finding the courage to speak Emma's name aloud for the first time in 3 long years. He took Lydia up to the East Ridge, where a solitary oak tree stood sentinel over a simple wooden cross. "She loved the view from here," Caleb said, his voice thick with a grief that was finally beginning to change shape. "She said it felt like you could see all the way to the edge of the world." He told her about the fever, about the way Emma had spent her final days nursing the sick in town until she had no strength left for herself. Lydia listened with a profound, quiet respect, never once trying to diminish Emma's memory or compete with the ghost of the woman Caleb had loved. Instead, she began to weave her own thread into the fabric of the ranch. She planted hardy winter herbs in pots along the kitchen windowsill and hung new, simple curtains that caught the pale Montana light. She didn't try to replace Emma, she simply made room for herself, proving that a heart, much like a house, could hold more than one story at a time. The tension that had defined their first meeting began to soften into a comfortable rhythm of shared work and low-voiced conversations by the fire, as the boundaries between stranger and friend began to blur into something much deeper and more dangerous. However, the fragile peace of the Warren Ranch was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when the sound of a high-stepping horse echoed in the yard. Caleb emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, to find a man who looked entirely out of place in the rugged Montana landscape. He was dressed in a tailored wool suit with a gold watch chain glinting against his vest, his dark hair slicked back with expensive pomade. He sat atop a flashy sorrel gelding with silver-mounted tack that spoke of wealth and arrogance. This was Thomas Ashford, the man Lydia had left behind in Philadelphia, and his presence felt like a poison seeping into the crisp mountain air. He didn't wait to be invited. He dismounted with a practiced grace and strode toward the house as if he already owned the ground beneath his feet. "Lydia," he called out, his voice smooth and carrying the entitled ring of a man used to being obeyed. Lydia appeared on the porch, her face turning a ghastly shade of white as she gripped the railing. Caleb stepped between them, the barrel of his rifle pointed toward the ground, but his intent unmistakable. The arrival of the city man brought with it the cold realization that the past was never truly buried. It simply waited for the right moment to come back and claim its due. "I've come to bring my fiancée home," Thomas said, offering Caleb a smile that was as cold and sharp as a razor blade. He looked Lydia over with a proprietary gaze that made Caleb's blood boil. "This little rebellion has gone on long enough, Lydia. Your departure was dramatic, I'll grant you that, but surely even you can see the absurdity of staying in this God-forsaken wilderness with a common laborer." Lydia's voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of iron. "I am not your fiancé, Thomas. I broke that bond the moment I found you with another woman in our own home. You have no claim on me." Thomas's expression hardened, the veneer of civilization cracking to reveal a cruel, calculating mind. "Our families had an agreement, and more importantly, your brother Samuel had debts. Debts that my father was kind enough to settle in anticipation of our union. $3,000 to be exact. If you do not return with me to Philadelphia, I will have the territorial authorities arrest you for theft and fraud. You are a pauper, Lydia, and in the eyes of the law you belong to the people who paid for your survival." The threat hung in the air like a heavy fog. $3,000 was an impossible sum, more than the entire value of the Warren Ranch's stock. Caleb watched the way Lydia flinched, the way the old fear began to cloud her eyes as she realized the cage she had fled was being rebuilt around her. Thomas pulled a sheaf of papers from his pocket, waving them with a sickening air of triumph. "I have the signatures, the ledgers, and the influence to ensure that no judge in this territory will take the word of a penniless teacher over the reputation of the Ashford family. You have 30 days to reconsider, Lydia. Either you come back and fulfill your obligations as my wife, or you spend those 30 days in a territorial prison before being sent back to Pennsylvania in chains." He tipped his hat to Caleb, a final mocking gesture of superiority, and climbed back onto his horse. As the sound of his departure faded into the distance, the silence that returned to the ranch was no longer peaceful. It was a countdown. Caleb looked at Lydia, seeing the crushing weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders once again, and he knew that the time for being careful was over. The ghost of the past had arrived, and it was no longer Emma. It was the living malice of a man who would rather destroy a woman than lose his grip on her. The shadow of Thomas Ashford's departure lingered over the Warren Ranch like a toxic residue, turning the crisp autumn air into something that tasted of ash and desperation. Lydia withdrew into herself, her movements becoming stiff and ghost-like as she began to pack her few belongings into her threadbare carpetbag once more. She was convinced that her presence was a curse, a magnet for a wealthy man's malice that would eventually pull Caleb's world down into the dirt. But Caleb, watching her from the doorway of the kitchen, felt a different kind of fire igniting in his chest, not the cold, slow-burning embers of grief, but a hot, protective rage. He realized that the $3,000 wasn't just a debt. It was a ransom for her soul. He stepped forward, his hand covering hers as she tried to fold a worn shawl. "You are not running, Lydia. Not from him, and certainly not from me. If you leave this house, you're just giving him exactly what he wants, the satisfaction of seeing you broken and alone again. But if you stay, if you truly stay, he has to go through me to get to you." Lydia looked up, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "He has the law on his side, Caleb. He has paper and gold. All we have is a neglected ranch and a handful of promises." Caleb gripped her shoulders, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Then we give the law something else to look at. We get married. Legally, here in the territory, a wife's person is protected under her husband's name. We strip him of his leverage by making you a Warren." The decision was made with the kind of grim, swift efficiency that the frontier demanded of those who wished to survive it. They rode into Cedar Falls the following morning, the sky a bruised purple that threatened the first true blizzard of the season. The ceremony was a sparse, hushed affair in the back room of the territorial office, conducted by a harried magistrate who smelled of tobacco and old ink. Tom and Sarah Bradley stood as witnesses, their faces etched with a mixture of concern and a strange, quiet approval. As Caleb slid a simple silver band, one he had purchased in haste from the local jeweler, onto Lydia's finger, the world seemed to settle into a new, terrifyingly permanent shape. When the magistrate pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb didn't feel the rush of joy he had felt with Emma. Instead, he felt a profound sense of duty and a dawning realization that he was no longer just protecting a stranger, but a part of his own soul. They filed the marriage certificate immediately, ensuring the timestamp was recorded before Ashford could file any legal claims. As they walked out of the office, the first heavy flakes of snow began to fall, muffling the sounds of the town. "Mrs. Warren," Caleb said, the title tasting strange, but right on his tongue. Lydia looked at him, her chin tilted up against the wind. "I will not be a wife in name only, Caleb. If I am to bear your name, I will bear the weight of this ranch beside you. No more secrets and no more hiding." The first week of their marriage was an intense, wordless period of transition, where the house itself seemed to be recalibrating to the presence of a new union. They moved Lydia's things into the main bedroom, a space that had been a shrine to Emma for 3 years, now suddenly filled with the scent of Lydia's lavender soap and the soft rustle of her movements. But the domestic peace was short-lived. In the middle of a Tuesday night, the horizon to the south turned a sickening, pulsating orange. The frantic pounding on their front door shattered the silence of the valley. Jim Parker, the town's liveryman, stood on the porch, his horse lathered in sweat and his face streaked with soot. "The Bradley place is going up, Warren. The barn is a torch and the wind is pushing the flames toward the house. Tom needs every hand that can hold a bucket." Caleb didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and rifle, but as he turned to tell Lydia to stay behind, he found her already dressed in heavy wool, clutching a bag filled with bandages, salves, and clean linens. "I am a teacher, but my mother was a nurse," she said, her eyes flashing with a fierce, cold light. "You fight the fire, Caleb. I'll fight the damage it does." They rode hard through the biting cold, the glow on the horizon growing until it looked as though the very gates of hell had opened in the middle of the Bitterroot Valley. The scene at the Bradley Ranch was a chaotic nightmare of screaming livestock, billowing black smoke, and the roar of a fire that seemed to have a hungry mind of its own. The barn was a towering inferno, the dry hay inside fueling a heat so intense it singed the hair on Caleb's arms from 50 feet away. He joined the bucket brigade, his muscles screaming as he hauled heavy iron pails of water from the well to the men drenching the roof of the Bradley house. Beside him, Lydia was a blur of competent, focused energy. She moved among the injured with a steady hand, treating the agonizing burns of the men who had tried to rescue the trapped horses and tending to Sarah Bradley, who was convulsing with smoke inhalation. The heat was a living thing, a predatory force that seemed to mock their puny human efforts. Caleb watched as the Bradley barn, the heart of his neighbor's livelihood, collapsed in a spectacular shower of sparks and flaming timber. It was in that moment of destruction, amidst the smell of charred wood and the sound of sobbing, that Caleb noticed something that made his blood run cold. Just past the edge of the firelight, near the tree line, he caught the brief, unmistakable glint of a silver-mounted saddle. A horseman was watching the carnage from the shadows, and though the figure was obscured by the smoke, Caleb knew the posture of that rider. It wasn't just a fire, it was a message. By the time the sun began to peek over the jagged mountain peaks, the fire was reduced to a smouldering skeletal heap of charcoal. The Bradley house had been saved, but the cost was devastating. Tom Bradley sat on the frozen ground, his face a mask of blackened ruin, staring at the space where his father's barn had stood for 20 years. The community of ranchers stood in a somber circle, their faces reflecting the grim reality of frontier life, that everything you built could be erased in a single night of malice. Lydia was still working, her dress scorched and her hands raw, moving among the men to offer water and quiet words of comfort. Caleb walked over to Tom, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. "We found something in the brush near the north fence, Tom. A kerosene tin and tracks from a high-stepping city horse. This wasn't a lightning strike or a tipped lamp." A low murmur of fury rippled through the gathered men. They were hard people who lived by a code of mutual survival, and the idea of a deliberate attack on one of their own was an unforgivable sin. Jake Morrison, a man of few words and a fast draw, looked at Caleb. "The city man at the hotel?" Caleb nodded, his jaw set like iron. "Ashford. He told Lydia he'd destroy anything she tried to build here. It seems he's a man of his word." The trial by fire had begun, and as Caleb looked at his soot-stained wife, he knew the peace they had sought was gone. They were now at war. In the grim, frost-bitten dawn following the fire, the men of the Bitterroot Valley did not wait for the slow wheels of distant bureaucracy to turn. Caleb Warren, his face still blackened by the Bradley barn's soot, led a silent procession of riders into Cedar Falls. They didn't come with torches or ropes, but with the cold, undeniable weight of frontier truth. In his saddlebag, Caleb carried the scorched kerosene tin found at the fence line, its distinctive markings tracing back to the very hotel where Thomas Ashford was currently enjoying a late breakfast. Marshall Cobb, a man whose skin was as weathered as the Montana landscape he patrolled, met them on the hotel steps. He took the tin, listened to the testimony of Jake Morrison's son, who had seen a city-dressed man scouting the Bradley Range, and felt the collective temperature of the valley rising toward a boiling point. "Money can buy a lot of things in Philadelphia, Mr. Ashford," Cobb stated as he confronted the man in the lobby, "but out here, it doesn't buy silence, and it certainly doesn't buy safety from a dozen men whose livelihoods you've tried to burn to the ground." Ashford, stripped of his gilded arrogance by the raw, unyielding stares of the ranchers, realized for the first time that his influence ended where the mountains began. While the men handled the physical evidence, Lydia was fighting a battle of intellect and paper. She spent the next 48 hours at the telegraph office, sending urgent queries to the Philadelphia Board of Education and the very bank her brother had allegedly defrauded. The responses that trickled back were a series of devastating blows to Ashford's fabricated narrative. There were no debts, no signed contracts, and certainly no legal standing for a man to claim a woman as property for the supposed sins of her kin. Lydia compiled these documents with the same meticulous care she used to mend Caleb's shirts, creating a fortress of truth that no crooked lawyer could breach. When the territorial judge, a man who valued the growth of the territory over the whims of Eastern aristocrats, reviewed the findings, he didn't just dismiss the claims against Lydia, he issued a formal protection order. Thomas Ashford was banned from the territory under threat of immediate imprisonment for arson and fraud. The last the valley saw of the city man was a hasty, unceremonious departure on the eastbound train, his fine clothes wrinkled and his pride scattered like ash in the Montana wind. The threat was gone, but the scars remained, serving as a permanent reminder of the day the Warrens chose to fight for the ground they stood upon. Spring arrived late that year, the snow surrendering to the sun in a messy, jubilant flood of mud and new grass. The Bitterroot Valley transformed from a monochromatic wasteland into a vibrant tapestry of green, and with the thaw came a new kind of rhythm to the Warren Ranch. The silence that had once defined Caleb's life was now a relic of a darker era. One morning, as the first wildflowers began to pepper the East Ridge, the house was filled with a different kind of sound, the sharp, piercing cry of a newborn. Lydia had labored through the night with the same quiet, iron-willed strength she had shown on the train platform, and as the sun crested the peaks, she placed a small, dark-haired girl into Caleb's trembling arms. They named her Hope, a word that had once felt like a mockery to Caleb but now felt like an anchor. He stood by the window, looking out toward the oak tree where Emma was buried, and for the first time he didn't feel the sharp, jagged edge of guilt. He felt a profound sense of continuity. He wasn't replacing the life he had lost, he was honoring the fact that love, much like the Montana soil, was capable of producing a second harvest if one was brave enough to plant the seeds in the wake of the storm. As the years unfolded, the Warren Ranch became more than just a place of survival. It became the heartbeat of the local community. Caleb and Tom Bradley, their bond forged in the heat of that devastating fire, worked together to establish a local cooperative that protected smaller ranchers from the predatory tactics of eastern speculators. Lydia, never content to be a mere observer, used her background in education to establish the valley's first formal schoolhouse, teaching the children of the frontier that knowledge was just as essential as a fast horse or a sharp plow. The house grew alongside the family, with two more children, Samuel and Emma Grace, filling the rooms with laughter and the beautiful, chaotic noise of a life lived to the fullest. Caleb often found himself watching Lydia from across the yard, marveling at the woman who had arrived with 47 cents and a broken heart, only to build an empire of affection. They were no longer two strangers trapped by a 3-day deadline. They were a testament to the idea that a mail-order beginning could blossom into a legacy of genuine, hard-won devotion. The shadows of the past had not disappeared, but they had retreated to the corners, providing depth to a picture that was now brilliantly illuminated by the present. 20 years after that fateful November day, Caleb stood once again on the platform in Cedar Falls. The town had grown, the wooden planks replaced by sturdy stone, and the mournful whistle of the 247 now sounded like the heartbeat of a thriving territory. He was waiting for his daughter, Hope, to return from her own studies in the east. And as the train pulled into the station, he felt a strange sense of circularity. Lydia stood beside him, her auburn hair now shot through with elegant silver, her hand tucked firmly into the crook of his arm. They looked at the mountains, the same jagged peaks that had once seemed like walls, and realized they were now just the borders of their home. "Margaret was right, you know," Lydia whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder as the steam from the locomotive billowed around them. "About what?" Caleb asked, looking down at the woman who had saved him from himself. "About Emma. She would have wanted you to be happy. She would have wanted this." Caleb squeezed her hand, his heart full of a peace that had been decades in the making. He finally understood that memory wasn't a prison. It was a foundation. You could love a ghost and still hold the hand of the woman standing right in front of you. Thank you so much for following this journey through the rugged heart of the Old West. This story of Caleb and Lydia is a powerful reminder that no matter how frozen our hearts might feel, there is always a chance for a new season if we are willing to open the door to a stranger. If you enjoyed this 5-part deep dive into the Warren Ranch legacy, please consider sharing this story with someone who needs a little hope today. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next exploration into the untold narratives of the frontier. Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet valley of your own, remember that every sunset is just a prelude to a brand new dawn. We've explored the broken promises, the silent houses, and the fires that forge us into who we are meant to become. Now, as the train pulls out of the station one last time, we leave the Bitterroot Valley behind, but the lessons of the Warrens stay with us. Until next time, keep looking toward the horizon, keep mending what's broken, and never stop believing in the power of a second chance.